Okay. So I am so happy to welcome Miriam Ament and Annette Geva. Miriam has a BA in American History from Barnard College, Columbia University, and an MA in Organizational Psychology from Teachers College, Columbia. Oh, good. You guys are letting people in. Thank you. Columbia University. Miriam was hospitalized 3 times for depression and encountered stigma and isolation from many friends and family members. As No Shame on You founder and executive director, Miriam is dedicated to utilizing her life experiences in order to normalize the mental health conversation and end the stigma. Annette Esqueva has a BS, a Bachelor's of Science, right, in psychology from the University of Toronto. Right, a PhD in clinical and experimental psychology from the University of Michigan, go blue, that's my alma mater, and a JD from Northwestern University, also having a good weekend, Pritzker School of Law. As Director of Strategic Initiatives at No Shame on You, Annette oversees the expansion and implementation of new mental health programming and initiatives. And she also advances development and organizational support efforts. I just want to tell everyone that I think it was Annette who came to me in the summer and said, would you like me to make a presentation? We were already in, you know, it was COVID, we were in isolation. And I said, yes, let's put it on the calendar for this year. And who knew, really, who knew that it's November, it's going to be December, and we're still you know, being very careful about COVID, and this can bring on so many different things to so many different people. Miriam has told me that if there's something that you would like to talk to her about, you can private chat her. And of course, as always, you can chat me and I will be asking questions at the end. We are on a couple of screens. So the thing that will not work is this. You can raise your hand virtually, and I think we'll be taking questions at the end. Yes, good, they're nodding their heads. Okay, with no further ado, Miriam and Annette.
Thank you so much, Vanessa. Good morning, everyone. As Vanessa said, my name is Miriam Ament, and I am the founder of No Shame on You. And we are so honored to be here with Makom Solel Lakeside. A little bit about No Shame on You. We're a Chicago-based organization dedicated to eliminating the stigma associated with mental health conditions and raising mental health awareness in the Jewish community and beyond. Our goal is for the people who need help to seek it and to educate family members and friends on how to provide support to those living with mental health conditions. We provide regularly occurring programming and distribute online and written resources. And before we get into our presentation, I want to let you know a little bit about what to expect during our time together. We're going to start with some background about what mental health conditions are. I'm going to share my mental health journey with depression. And then we're going to delve into understanding depression, how to cope with it, and taking the stigma out of mental health conditions. And then after that, as Vanessa said, we will take any questions that you have. It is now my pleasure to turn things over to my colleague, Dr. Annette Geva.
Good morning, everyone. Can I just confirm that you can see the PowerPoint on the, okay, terrific. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. I think, as Vanessa said, who knew when she and I were talking back in the sunny days of summer that we would still be in the depths of this pandemic. And quite frankly, this is a time of year when also typically we do see people struggling a little bit more emotionally anyway. And I think the fact that this year we have, you know, we've already had Pesach without our family, we've done Rosh Hashanah without our families, now we're doing Thanksgiving, then we have Hanukkah. So lots to talk about. I do just want to remind everyone that this presentation is is for educational purposes only. And so if you yourself are struggling, or if you know someone who's struggling, I'm going to have some resources at the end, but I also think it's, very important, to, even reach out to Vanessa, or reach out to us, or reach out to your primary care physician to get some help and assistance. As I talk along here, you'll be aware that what's abnormal is not struggling and feeling depressed. It's what's abnormal is being able to say that you've never struggled and that you don't know anybody who's ever struggled, because just the data don't show that, and the lifetime experiences. So we'll start off with what is a mental health disorder. But I think actually let's begin first with what is mental health. And that is, it's our emotional, psychological, and social well-being. It not only impacts how we think, feel, and act, but it also determines how we handle stress. And when we're mentally healthy, we're more likely, it's not just that we can cope better, it's that actually we're more likely to realize our potential and our abilities. Conversely, a mental health disorder is something that disrupts your ability to function in your daily life, right? So that's like carrying out daily activities, engage in satisfying personal relationships. And we see that it really impacts everything that we are. It impacts our thinking, our emotions, our behavior, and also our physical state. And you can actually, of course, struggle in these areas, even if you don't, technically have the, meet the diagnosis. And in fact, mental health disorders are quite common. So in a given year, 20% of adults live with some kind of mental health disorder, and nearly 3/4 of the population experience symptoms. And that's like in a regular year. That's not in a COVID year even. So you can just imagine how everyone around you is doing right now. So when I talk about mental health disorders, I'm talking, we're going to focus on depression today, but certainly there are lots of other disorders around, or other things that people experience. There's anxiety, bipolar disorder, there's substance use and addiction. In fact, almost 10% of the population struggles with substance use problems, and PTSD. Sometimes people ask me about attention deficit disorder, like ADHD. That technically is not a mental health disorder, but you should know that that is often then becomes associated with depression and anxiety. So an important thing in terms of not ignoring those symptoms if you see them in your kids or grandkids, or you yourself are experiencing that. And we see that mental health disorders don't appear uniformly across the population. It's higher among women. We'll talk in a little bit about, even though women experience depression at a higher rate, men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women. Mental health disorders are more common among some minorities, like so people who belong to the LGBTQ populations or community, people who are of mixed or multiracial adults, and then we also see that mental health struggles 50% begin by age 14. So this isn't the kind of thing where if you see it again in someone a child, grandchild, you don't say, oh, they'll grow out of it. It's the opposite. Now's a good time to start addressing it. I like to think of learning skills to deal with how you're feeling as like a language. And we all know that the younger you are, the easier it is to learn a second or third language. And likewise, learning these mental health skills, the younger you are, the more sort of innate it ends up feeling. And then one of the things that's quite upsetting is that particularly in the United States, suicide is on the rise. And in fact, among 15 to 40-year-olds, it is now the second leading cause of death. So, and now we're going to add a little bit of COVID into this and think, well, this is like it's a worldwide stressor. And what's happening is it's leading to an exacerbation of pre-existing symptoms, and of course, adding to everyone else's sense of feeling. And this is, what's happening. We have isolation, we have a lack of structure, a lack of routine, a loss of traditional milestones, traditions, accomplishments. We have this global fear for our health. And we have amplifications of inequalities. And then, we'll just add to that a very stressful election for some, for many. There's been some civil unrest, there's been some racial reckoning, there's fear of climate change. I promise we're gonna get to the sort of more hopeful part of like, how do we deal with this? But this is the reality in which we live right now. And what we're seeing is truly anxiety, just a recent study within the last month or so, it talks about how anxiety has increased 3 times. Depression has increased 4-fold from what it was, a year ago. And disproportionate impact on young adults, caregivers, and that's caring for children, caring for parents, caring for spouses, loved ones, essential workers, and we don't even know right now what the full impact of this pandemic is going to be on our mental health. And in fact, many people are now talking about it as like the next pandemic. Right now, there's the COVID pandemic, and then we're going to deal with the mental health pandemic. The silver lining is that I think it has actually brought to the forefront for many people how our mental health is impacted by what goes around us, how normal it is. And I think it's been an area that often due to stigma that's actually been quite neglected in terms of the seriousness with which it's been addressed. And even this, despite the fact that we know that it impacts individuals, people who are depressed have a 40% higher risk of developing cardiovascular disease. So, again, you can ignore this mental health, problem, but it actually is gonna, it's gonna get you later, let's put it that way. Higher chance of stroke or high blood pressure. People who experience depression are 2 times more likely to drop out of high school. So again, we know, in terms of long-term community impact, even what that means when unemployment is high or when people are underemployed. Mood disorders account for, mood disorders are, with the exception of sort of pregnancy-related hospitalizations, mood disorders are the most common cause of hospitalization for people under the age of 45. So again, there's like a real cost that society pays for this. And the reality is that this sort of mental health struggles, it's not just out there, right? It's also within our community, is within our Jewish community. And it's not always clear that the community has handled it as well as it could or should. And actually, to hear more about that, I'm actually going to turn it now to Miriam to talk a little bit about her experiences and her journey. So here we go.
Well, thank you, Anat. So as you can see from what Anat said, mental health disorders are quite prevalent, and they really impact so many people. And most alarming, depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation are all on the rise. Suicide is often preceded by depression, and I'm now going to turn our attention to my journey. I am someone who has struggled with depression, and though my story is unique, there are universal elements to it. Undiagnosed depression, a lack of awareness and understanding of what was happening to me, people not knowing how to support me, lacking the knowledge and the skills of how to manage my symptoms. And then in addition to dealing with my symptoms of depression and anxiety, I often had to cope on my own. It has been very lonely at times, but through my experience, I educated myself on depression and suicide and made a point of taking my experience and using it to educate others and how they can help themselves and support others. So starting with my journey through some very tough times, growing up in Highland Park, for the most part, my life was good. I did well in high school academically and made some great friends, but I do remember going through some emotionally rough patches in my teens. While the pictures show a happy girl, here I am with my 2 older brothers, there were days where I couldn't get out of bed, and other days where I got myself to school, but I couldn't focus and concentrate and felt like I was alienated from the whole experience, like the whole world just didn't get it. Nobody talked much about emotions and mental illness back then, So I didn't realize the severity of my situation and how in need I was of professional help. In retrospect, I now know I was living with depression. After high school, I went to Israel for a gap year. A great experience, as you can tell by all the pictures of me hanging out with my friends having a great time. But again, what the camera didn't capture were bouts of nonstop crying and lots of sleepless nights. Neither I nor anyone around me knew how to identify my symptoms. In hindsight, it's clear that my depression had gotten quite severe. After Israel, I went to New York to attend Barnard College. Again, from the outside, you would think I was completely on course and headed for success and happiness. And in some ways it was. I really liked Barnard. I learned a lot and I met some great, amazing people. But underneath it all, I was still living with depression. It wasn't a bad mood and it wasn't homesickness. As in high school and in Israel, I would have periods of nonstop crying. Looking back, it is so clear to me what was going on. But at the time, I didn't realize that I needed to get proper treatment. I didn't know that there was a way to get better, to live without the debilitating symptoms of depression. In my 20s, things got progressively worse. I finally sought help in therapy and was prescribed medication, but it wasn't the right therapist, and I wasn't so vigilant about my meds, since I still didn't grasp the severity of my situation. Things kept getting worse. I was living on the Upper West Side of New York at the time. I felt like I was the only one of my friends who was still single. They were either married, engaged, or dating someone. I felt more and more alone. I felt more and more hopeless. The despair seemed to have no end date, and it just went on and on. A friend of mine who was a doctor suggested that I go to the hospital. I should note that the first time I went to the hospital was on Oscars night, the historic night Halle Berry won an Oscar. I've always been a big fan of entertainment and pop culture. So my willingness to go to the hospital that night, the realization that I couldn't sit and focus on one of my all-time favorite nights and was completely consumed by loneliness, hopelessness, and despondency is truly a reflection of how tough a place I was in. I was hospitalized twice. Because of the stigma surrounding mental health, I didn't want too many people to know, just a few friends and family members. And even those few were too many as it turned out. One of my then closest friends called me while I was in the hospital and said, I only want to talk to you when you're happy. So let's not talk again for a while. And then I never heard from her again. I was already feeling so isolated, and this friend's response completely broke me and ended up extending my hospital stay. If someone I considered a close friend would stop talking to me, what would other people think? From then on, I kept my hospitalizations a secret. The only person I told was the man who is now my husband. I was hospitalized a third time after an attempt at suicide, which I now understand was a huge cry for help. I was still depressed, experiencing suicidal ideation, loneliness, joblessness. I was in my early 30s and was completely lost in so much pain and felt hopeless. After that third hospitalization, I got really serious about my well-being. After meeting with a few therapists, I found the right therapist for me, someone who I connected with, saw my strengths, and understood me. It is important to note that just as with any other medical professional, where we often get second or more opinions, sometimes the first mental health professional you see is not the right fit, and that's okay and shouldn't be a deterrent to find the right one. I was also vigilant about my medication, making sure to take it consistently at the same time every day. I was back in Chicago, working at a law firm and married. Things were going well. I was finally on track, but I still had a deep, dark secret that I rarely spoke about, even with the few people who knew what it was. And then 10 years after my last hospitalization, my fascination with all things celebrity led me to a life-changing lunch. I had won a charity auction and found myself across the table from Glenn Close, the actress who was nominated last year for an Oscar and is getting Oscar buzz again this year. I knew she was a big advocate of mental health awareness because of her sister, and I ended up telling her my whole story. That was the first. Not only was she a stranger, but she was Glenn Close of all people. It ended up being transformative. Sharing my story was a breakthrough for me. It made clear that the stigma and shame that friend had made me feel many years earlier was not there when speaking to a stranger I never thought I'd see again. And a fun fact is that I've actually seen Glenn and been in touch with her since that first meeting. But I started to realize that I could turn what seemed to be such a negative aspect of my life into something positive, and perhaps I could use it to help other people. So I started doing some research, and I learned how common mental illness is. According to research, one of the best ways to eradicate mental health stigma is for people to have contact with an individual living with a mental health condition. So knowing all this, the startling numbers, and realizing that opening up about my story could help others, I decided to make a career change and devote myself full-time to mental health awareness and start No Shame on You. If you had told me 15 years ago that I'd be open about my mental health journey and running a mental health organization, I never would have believed you. And it really shows that there is hope and light for you or anyone you know living with a mental health condition. I created No Shame on You in 2014 with a group of supporters who became my board members. Our goal is for the people who need help to seek it, for family members and friends to know how to provide proper support, and to save lives. In 6 years, we have reached thousands of people through our in-person programs, awareness events, and social media. And here we are at marching at the Skokie 4th of July parade. We have over 110,000 social media followers. We have distributed tens of thousands of magnets, fact sheets, and stress balls. And it has been 6 years filled with meaningful experiences that let me know we are having an impact. Right before COVID, someone who has attended our programs told me a colleague of hers noticed the No Shame on You magnet in her office. That sparked the two to open up and talk and normalize the conversation about mental health, and that is exactly what we're all about. Since COVID, No Shame on You has offered over 100 virtual programs to provide mental health support to all ages. Here are examples of some of our current and upcoming programs: expert-led discussions, yoga series focused on mindfulness and mental well-being, and much more. These programs are centered around reducing stigma and supporting well-being. We also held an Illustrate Your Emotions art challenge for youth from kindergartners through seniors in high school, and stay tuned for our second art challenge coming soon. We are currently accepting applications from high school sophomores and juniors for our Teen Ambassador program. Applications are due tomorrow, so there's actually still time to apply. And with that, I am now going to turn things back over to my colleague, Anat Geva.
Thanks, Miriam. And actually, I'm going to just give a shout out here. I don't know, Miriam, did you mention, maybe you did, but I want to stress that all of our programs are free, and that we do this mindful yoga most Tuesdays at 4 p.m. And this will sort of connect to some of the things that I talk about towards the end of our conversation here. So today, we're gonna focus a little bit more on depression, which actually isn't the most common disorder, but it is likely the most debilitating one, or one of the most debilitating ones. Anxiety is actually more common. But let's begin to talk about what is depression. So as I mentioned earlier, mental health disorders are things that affect your behavior, your emotions, your thoughts, and your physical state. And what's key, though, is that it's changes in, right? So if you have somebody who's normally quite quiet and what we would consider an introvert, the issue isn't that they continue to be an introvert. What might sort of spark your attention is that they are doing even less than they used to, possibly, or they're more irritable than they used to be. So it's the changes that you're looking for. In terms of behavior, right? So like I said, it's changes that involve maybe withdrawing from close friends and family. Maybe you're seeing an increase in, person needs a drink at the end of the day. It could be this is a person who used to love to do art and now is spending a lot more time just locked up in their room watching, Netflix. Sort of being very slowed down. And then, of course, there are, in terms of behavior, and I'll talk about this in a bit, also looking at people who might engage in some self-harming behaviors. In terms of emotions, which I think this is what typically people think about with being depressed, is this sort of very sad state of being. But the truth is, it's also suddenly feeling, increasingly overwhelmed by things. It's being indecisive. Irritability is a big one, in the sense that people don't always notice that you have an irritable, you're suddenly more irritable. Well, that actually is a symptom of depression. And it's particularly in younger kids and teens. And of course, some people always say, well, teenagers are a pain in the butt anyway, all the time. But again, this is the sort of, teens can be irritable one day and then nice the next, if things are quote unquote normal. But it's more that sort of consistently constant irritability in all people. The thoughts are also tend to be more pessimistic and more self-critical, right? So I'm worthless. This is my fault. I can't believe I did that. And then not being able to sort of, sort of having regret be a dominant thought in your mind of, I should have done this. I wish I had done that. Why did I do this? Right? I'm worthless. And then in terms of some of the physical symptoms, we're talking about headaches, tummy aches, significant weight loss or gain, and just feeling really run down. Those are the, generally speaking, the kinds of symptoms you would see. Now, in terms of the causes of depression, this is sort of important. One thing to note is that literally depression, it's an interplay between multiple factors, and it is truly not something over which somebody has control. So, and I think that's really important to remember because, you know, in terms of then sort of what is their attitude towards people who have depression or if we ourselves are feeling depressed, it doesn't mean anything is wrong with you in the sense of you should be better. It means there's a lot of stuff going on. And luckily there are ways to address them. But there are lots of things that can lead to depression. So for instance, from a biological perspective, there's some evidence out there now that actually people with depression have sort of an inflammation of the brain, you know, that leads to some decrease in gray matter or volume in your brain. Now, again, we can talk about cause versus effect, but the point is there is a biological basis to it. Brain chemistry, right? This is often the way we talk about it is a lack, insufficient amount of certain neurotransmitters in the brain. And one of the ways that that's addressed is through medication, which then increases the amount of neurotransmitters that are available to alleviate symptoms. There's the impact of hormones, right? This is why this postpartum depression, that is or thyroid issues lead to hormone changes, which actually cause people to feel depressed. There's genetics. That's, if it existed in your family in a previous generation, it is also possible that you will inherit it. And then there's family dynamics or temperament, which is sort of what is modeled for a child when they're younger in terms of modeling how to cope with certain stressful life events, or if you had a traumatic childhood, that also, again, impacts it might lead to someone ending up being depressed. And then you sort of can have all this going on, and then there's like a catalyst, right? So a catalyst is something over which we have no control. And that can be an economic change, it can be a relationship breakup, it can be the passing of someone, medical condition that you're struggling with, it can be even a medication side effect. And then we basically have COVID-19 as, sort of to state the obvious, COVID-19 is an event over which none of us have control, but that we're all dealing with right now. And I mean, you can see through this list here, like I said, there's, death, racial injustice, fear of health, isolation, economic insecurity. I mean, unfortunately, the list goes quite on. And again, you take that plus some sort of pre-existing issues like your biology or your brain chemistry, it is not uncommon then, or not unlikely that you might be struggling with some you might have a mental health struggle, excuse me. The main crises associated with depression, one is that there's this, is maladaptive behaviors that then lead to things like failure to launch, which is sort of like an inability to just, failure to launch refers more to maybe like teens or young adults who don't seem to be able to go out there and do what we consider to be adult-like behaviors. It could be trouble holding down a job. It could be avoiding social relationships, eating disorders, substance use, right? And then you can see how that just exacerbates, a feeling depressed, because then you're also not succeeding and you truly don't have things that sort of make you feel good about yourself. A lot of talk is about suicide. I think that's because obviously in terms of, that's truly about, whether or not you live. And that can be suicidal ideation, which is basically a lot of passive thoughts, about deaths, but without any sort of behavior to do it. And then there's actual suicide. And then there's self-injury, which is people who are feeling very overwhelmed with emotions, and they might actually harm themselves, like they might cut themselves or put out cigarettes on their body. And the reason they do that is that they feel like that pain is something that they can control because they're making it happen, and it can lead to a bit of a relief. It's temporary, so long term you're actually creating a longer term issue. But the fear here, of course, is that that's not a very good way to cope with the depression, and secondly, there's a fear that death could be accidental. So that's why it's another reason why you want to address it. Let's talk for just a second about suicide. And just to be clear, most people who are depressed are not suicidal, but most people who are feeling suicidal or who have died by suicide, do have a mood disorder. So that could be depression, bipolar disorder. It's people who, again, substance use is quite common. We see that we've also seen in terms of gender differences, I think I mentioned this before, men are 3 times more likely to die by suicide than women. Another risk factor for men is a change like a loss of job or divorce actually really increases the likelihood. And we see that part of the reason likely that men are more likely to die than women by suicide is that men are far more likely to use highly lethal methods such as firearms. And firearms account for about half of suicide deaths. And I think you're 3 times or 4 times more likely to die by suicide if you have a firearm in your home. And then we see that LGBTQ population is more likely to attempt suicide. And that's sort of this belief that the understanding is that they're dealing here then with like the sort of stigma of being depressed, but on top of that, mental health stigma, but on top of that, they're also dealing with stigma associated with their sexual orientation or their sexual identity. So we see how important acceptance is, actually societal acceptance. Let's talk then for a second about coping with depression. And actually, this is what we're going to sort of focus on now for the rest of this morning. There's prevention. So what can we do so that we decrease the likelihood that our depression will be something that will prevent us from being our best selves? What are the kinds of interventions that can happen? What is some treatments? I'm not going to specify particular psychological approaches, but just like what are the things that we need to think about? And then what are some support strategies? Everything I'm saying now is sort of applying to either how you can help somebody or how you should start thinking about it for yourself. And where are the places that maybe you could be asking for some help? So in terms of, coping with depression, we've seen some of this already. This is the idea that some of this is in our control and some of it is not. Genetics and biochemistry are not necessarily things, you have a predisposition to depression. It does not mean that depression is inevitable. It does not mean that you can't take action to mitigate the struggle. But it is important then to become aware of your triggers and your stressors and avoid them. And in terms of the kinds of things that you can do is, as I've been told my whole life, and it turns out it's true, sleep is really important. First of all, we make a lot of bad decisions when we don't sleep. Secondly, we're more irritable and we have less attention towards things, and we're more likely to make stupid mistakes, which then might exacerbate whatever's going on. And quite frankly, we sleep because that's when our body needs to sort of rebuild itself. And on a related note, what you put into your body also makes a difference. There is now more and more stuff, not just that nutrition is important in terms of, again, our general physical well-being, but that actually some foods, I think there's talk now, for instance, about how nutrition is important in terms of like inflammation of like in arthritis and other sort of disorders, sort of physical disorders. But if there are things coming out now that actually nutrition can also play a role. in how we feel more directly. There's things like your environment, like what can you do to A, give yourself some structure, and B, you know, our surroundings are important to us. Having a plant by your office is actually helpful. Making sure you go outside for walks, or making sure you see a you know, green space is important, or the color that you paint your walls. I mean, these are all minor things, and they all do make differences. So that's, you know, one thing in terms of prevention. In terms of intervention, we're going to talk about two things. One is, how do you create a positive mental health culture by destigmatizing mental health disorders? And then the other is, how do you, developing an action plan. We're going to start by talking about mental health stigma. And the question here is, how do you begin to create a positive mental health culture through destigmatization? And we'll start off by saying, okay, but what is mental health stigma? So mental health stigma is the false belief that those with mental or behavioral disorders, basically it's something that you're in control of, and that the fact that you're struggling is because you lack control or you lack the will to get better. It's also then the idea that people who are struggling are frightening, are dangerous, are inferior, and ultimately these negative attitudes and behaviors lead to a widening of the gulf, widening of the gulf between those who are struggling and those who are not. And then that will lead to prejudice and discrimination. Why does this happen? Lots of research on why there's mental health stigma, but the reality, but what ends up happening, like I said, is that people think that it's about self-control and choice. And then, as I said earlier, what we really need to do is, instead of thinking that depression and mental health disorders are uncommon, is that realize that what's uncommon is that you yourself have never struggled, or that nobody you know has ever struggled. So just, if you think about it in terms of numbers, it's very normal, right? It's just like, it's like breaking a leg. And then the stigma results in shame, delay, or failure to seek help, which just makes it worse for people. If you're feeling ashamed, you don't go to your friends for help. That makes you feel even worse about yourself. One thing I'll just say really quickly is also, if you think about mental health insurance coverage, before the Affordable Care Act, insurance companies did not have to provide parity or even provide at all mental health coverage. And what's continued, even in sort of today's world, is that mental health providers are actually not reimbursed at the same rate as what the market bears, actually. And so the result is that a lot of mental health providers just don't take insurance. And I just want you to think about the absurdity of having to pay out of pocket to see a therapist when you would never consider paying out of pocket, maybe not never, but unlikely to consider paying out of pocket regularly to go see your heart surgeon or to go to the orthopede to fix a broken leg. If you don't take care of your mental health struggles, it's not a problem that goes away, and it just increases dysfunction and increases stress at home, in your work, in your relationships. And then, worst case is, like I said, suicide. Or previously we spoke about this, excuse me. So how do you end stigma? Well, there's education, there's thinking about your language, and then there's the kind of intentional behavior that you can engage in. So first things first, let's talk about ending stigma in terms of language. The words that we use matter. Okay? So one thing to think about is, again, if someone has a broken leg, you don't say they are a broken leg. We understand that the broken leg is just something, an element of what that person is dealing with at that moment, right? So you don't say we say she broke her leg. We don't say she is broken leg. And likewise, actually, it's important when we're talking about someone feeling depressed or feeling anxious, is instead of just saying, she is depressed, say she is struggling with depression, because right off the bat, just phrasing it that way makes it so that we're seeing that the person is more than their mental health disorder, that the mental health disorder is just a characteristic of who they are. Another thing is when we talk about people dying by suicide, the word commit is something that we probably should phase out when it comes to suicide, because commit itself is a very stigmatizing word, right? We commit a crime, we commit a sin. But actually people who are suicidal or who die by suicide are victims, and they need our compassion. So we can say the person died by suicide, the person completed suicide. But I think you can see that just taking out that word commit, we're sort of, it becomes a more neutral statement and less judgmental. The other thing that we need to do is we need to be intentional. And that means being intentional in terms of normalizing mental health struggles. One, checking in more regularly with people, so they'll feel more open to talking to you if they themselves are struggling. And B, if you think someone's struggling, it really makes a difference to make efforts to connect with them. Right now, we have COVID. It makes it much harder to just, stop by someone's house with a meal or with a cup of coffee and say hi. And so this is the era where we have to take advantage of Zoom, texts, dropping off care packages. Think about what is your chesed committee at your synagogue doing right now when someone is incapacitated because they broke an arm. Do the same thing. Making sure you check in, or sending meals, or setting up a meal train, or again, just calling them up and saying, hi, let's talk. I want to see how things are going. And then be vulnerable. If you're comfortable, be open and talk about your emotions. There is a way to maintain your privacy, but still make it clear that you're open to talking about feelings. And like I said earlier, a silver lining of COVID is the normalization of mental health challenges. So let's take advantage of that. And also modeling support. So don't just talk about it for others, be honest about your own experiences. A really important thing is normalizing self-care. So that's like drawing boundaries. That's, comfortable to say, if you're working, today I'm gonna, sorry, I can't take that meeting at 1. I'm going for a mindful walk, or I have a yoga class, or you know what, I just need a little bit of me time right now. So, just modeling that actually has an impact. The other piece of intervention is also developing an action plan, right? So why do we need to develop an action plan? Think about it like, if you're mapping out a route to go from point A to point B, it's usually good to look at the map before you actually get in the car. And so likewise, it's good to start thinking about how to help people before the mental health symptoms become too serious. So the way to do this is, it's sort of a 4-step process, which is evaluating the risk for suicide or harm, reassuring and educating, encouraging treatment, and then suggesting, just saw there's an error here with the numbering. The 4th one is suggesting support strategies. We'll start with evaluating for risk. This is like, if some of you know Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? There's you start with very basic physical and safety needs, and then you sort of move up in terms of what we need to provide for people. And likewise, when someone is feeling mentally unwell, safety is the first concern. And so if you do have concerns about somebody feeling, being unsafe, or feeling like they are contemplating taking action that might be harmful to their physical well-being, it's really important to ask people directly. And by that, I mean, don't think that, and that means 2 things. One, don't think that by asking, you're planting an idea that they didn't already think of. And secondly, when you ask, you're actually showing in some way that you care and that you want to have a conversation with them. And the other thing just to note is, somebody who is talking about suicide is not, some people have said, oh, well, if they're talking about it, they're not going to do it. that's actually inaccurate. Somebody who's talking about it is someone who you really need to watch. The next thing after you evaluate, there's reassuring and there's educating. I think it's, we have to think about this again. With mental health, struggles are common. So make sure that if you see someone who's struggling, is to do what you can to not appear judgmental, and to ask questions to show you care. And now, in terms of the education, this is a great time, right, to share some of what you're learning today about how it's not in their control, and that it's very common, and that there are multiple factors that are involved. By the way, one thing that you might hear some people say is, I'm terrible for feeling this badly because there's so many people who have it much worse than I do. So sort of this belittling of their struggle. And again, there's so many different catalysts for what makes a person feel depressed, and every case is something that should be taken seriously. You don't have to be homeless to feel insecure and depressed and hopeless. So this is sort of like the do not trivialize. If someone's telling you they're feeling terrible, telling them to put a smile on your face and lighten up and get over it is not helpful. What you really should be doing is, and again, don't say snap out of it. Don't say, oh, it could be so much worse. What you really want to do is validate that there's a struggle, that they're not, that it seems like things are really hard, and then turn to what we're going to talk a bit about, encouraging treatment or encouraging some support strategies to help them. In terms of encouraging treatment, here's where you could help a friend or a family member, or think about it for yourself, which is that people who are struggling with depression are far more likely to seek help if someone close to them suggests it. I don't think I mentioned earlier that most people who are struggling with depression, A, don't get treatment because they don't realize that they should, and B, the average time between the onset of feeling depressed and actually getting help is 11 years. So again, think about that. If you had broken your leg, would you wait 11 years until you went to a doctor? I hope not. So just remember that people who are feeling depressed are more likely to get help if you suggest it. And what's even better is if you actually help them in the process. Because again, someone who's depressed and is feeling not motivated and feeling like unworthy is actually not necessarily going to rush out and sort of take action, especially if you're not aware of where you can get resources. So as I said earlier, I think synagogues are a good place to start. Your director of education, going to your primary care physician is very helpful. And if someone is not interested in getting help, it's actually important to ask why they don't want help. Is it because, again, they feel like this isn't a real disorder? Or is it because they feel that they can't afford it, or because they don't want someone to find out? So find out why, because usually there's a way to get through it. Get through to them and get help. Support strategies. This is sort of the less formal, in the sense that these are things that don't necessarily involve going to, physicians or psychologists or psychiatrists. This is encouraging social support. Isolation is one of the things that really exacerbates sadness and depression. And so making sure that a person who is not feeling particularly good is either with people, or at least you're checking in with that person, is really important. So this can be finding a support group, which, by the way, can be very empowering and destigmatizing, because you're with other people who are going through the same struggles, and it's always good to have your feelings validated and to know that other people understand you. It could also mean making sure that peers and family are checking in more regularly. It's also about encouraging self-care strategies. And this is about being very specific. So there's a concept in psychology, a treatment approach called behavioral activation. And that approach basically says, you know, when we do things that make us feel better, not only do we feel better, but then actually we're more likely to engage in more behaviors that make us feel better. But it's important to be very specific and to be accountable, especially when you're starting this. So, and you want to kind of look at your biological, psychological, and social needs, right? So biological could be, you know, I'm going to go on a walk today. It could be, I'm going to go on a walk today. Excuse me. I'm going to go on a walk today at 9 a.m. And I'm going to walk from this point to that point and come back. It could be psychological. I'm going to attend the yoga class, you know, at 4 p.m. That's a mindfulness yoga class that No Shame on You offers. It can be social, right? Again, you don't want to isolate. So I'm going to Zoom with so-and-so tomorrow night at 7 p.m. And then I'm going to throw something out there that's just will blow your mind. You can also not Zoom and talk on the phone while you go on a walk. So then you could say, you know, Judy, let's talk tomorrow at 10 a.m. I'm going to walk along the lake, and you can walk along, you know, you can walk in your backyard, wherever, right? But like you're sort of both engaging in an outdoor activity, you're socializing, you are accountable to somebody, and just that, because that we know being outside and we know exercise makes you feel better. Just that actually is already going to increase the likelihood that you're going to engage in more positive reinforcing behaviors. And then there's less traditional approaches, right? I mean, light therapy has been shown to work. You know, what can you do, as I mentioned earlier, for your home environment that can make you feel better? What are things that you should be eating that can make you, that, you know, what can you put in your body that'll make you feel much better? And I think it's important just to remember that, you know, even knowing what we know, stigma is hard to overcome. You know, there's the sort of public stigma, which is what people think of mental health in general. And then there's the fact that often people internalize that stigma and then themselves become judgmental about something that they shouldn't be. So, right, so people then end up feeling this shame. But we know that peer support and treatment are really important. We know that it's important to change our mental health culture and to make sure that we have steps to take. And with the right approach, so education to destigmatize, social support, treatment, you know, struggles can be mitigated and a person can return to a sense of well-being. And so with that, I will thank you all for sticking around and for attending. I'm going to leave this up. These are some mental health and suicide prevention resources. Most of them are national resources. But I do want to highlight the Crisis text line and the National Suicide Prevention Hotline. Those are numbers that you can call and get help if you are in crisis. I'm happy to share down the road maybe some other resources that might be more specific to this, you know, to the Makom Solel community. But with that, I think I'm happy to open it to questions.
I want to thank both of you so much and reiterate a couple of things. One, feel free to reach out to me, but also to our clergy. And for all of us, except for Ashley Plotnick, we are not therapists, but we have more resources of where to send you. I'm also was very taken at the very beginning. You said that this session is not, you know, instead of therapy, that this is like the first step on a journey, I would say. And I would also, many of us have insurance who will cover this. And I think between stigma and not wanting to ask, people don't even know that that is available. And I highly recommend it. The first question I have, what if your family member refuses help and firmly believes it will not help? Neither has to do with stigma.
Yeah. So first of all, I think that goes back to a little bit of what I mentioned earlier, which is to find out a little bit more about why they won't get help. And because really, it could be financial. It could be because they think they should be able to get over it. It could be because they feel that, I'll tell you, even at the beginning of this pandemic, I would tell my kids, our people have gone through much worse than having to stay home and sit on the couch and watch TV, right? Like, I'll start talking about my grandparents and what they went through in Europe in the 1930s and 40s, and then at a certain point I realized, okay, I'm being a little it's true, but it's being a little bit over dramatic. But secondly, okay, but that's not their life. And this is a true struggle. And we just have to deal with what's in the moment. So I think that that's a important thing, is to sort of understand a little bit more about why they're resistant. And then the other piece of it is that they don't have to, if treatment is not something that they are willing to acknowledge or do, I would definitely think about, are there other ways to provide support? Are there, encouraging, like I said, some certain activities, encouraging certain social opportunities, support groups, family members who can check in more regularly, nutrition, just what are the things that this person is willing to engage in? Because I think the problem is you'd have to understand a little bit more about why they're not interested, because that will actually lead you right to the solution. I think it is important to say to that person, look, but if you get to this point, I need you to call me. And I think that unfortunately, you probably have now taken it on yourself to at least do some more regular check-ins.
I have another question, and this is getting into treatment, so you can answer as you may. This person would like to know what they think about the use of shock treatments, as they understand that they're not invasive and traumatic anymore.
It's a good question. It's not a first line of defense. I think it's still considered to be, for more treatment resistant kind of depression. And in light of the fact that we would need to know, certainly not my area of expertise, but certainly there would need to be someone who would do a more proper evaluation of when that's appropriate. Because that's true, there are all sorts of other alternative treatments now also. That people are, like there's transmagnetic cranial stimulation. And again, those are usually sort of down the road kind of approaches, A, and B, right, so much more needs to be known about the person's specific situation.
And I have a question now, and we're coming towards the end here. As a community, so many of our community are mourning the loss of a wedding, a graduation, fill in the blank.
Right.
How as the community can we help, and what last words do you have for us?
I'll say a couple words and then I maybe let Miriam, if she may, finish it off. But I would say that this is exactly the time to get creative and think about other ways that the community can celebrate. Especially as we're coming on the winter months and we can't do an outdoor drive-by, kind of thing that maybe some people have been engaged in at this point. But it's important to recognize how important those events are. And it's important to still figure out a way to celebrate them and mark those occasions. You can't just say, we're going to skip. Don't say, I'm just going to skip Thanksgiving this year, or I'm going to just skip, Hanukkah with the grandkids. Like let's think about creative ways that we can still be together and socially support one another. And think proactively, right? That's the other thing about it. Miriam, do you want to say last words?
Yeah. Just to add to that, I think in ways to do that are, when you cook a dish, share it with your family WhatsApp or your friends WhatsApp and stuff like that, where, and appreciating what you do have and sort of trying to keep the rituals that go along with family occasions or holidays and try to adapt them to this, way we're living right now. But also reaching out to old friends appreciating. I have a friend I'm Zooming with more often. We never talked this much before COVID, and now I'm appreciating we set aside this time to Zoom, and we're, you know, it's like a part of my routine, and I love it. So I think it's trying to appreciate or make time for things that you normally might not have, and appreciating these friends and family members in ways that you may not have been able to do before, which doesn't, it's not easy because we're still all experiencing a loss, but I think trying to shift it and appreciate people and these times in different ways.
Well, I think that's a good way to end it. I'll just add on, if you need help with WhatsApp, if you don't know what that is, let me know. And I heard on Thanksgiving, Zoom, it's not going to be 40 minutes. You can have as long as you want. So you can get your own account. You can talk to whoever you want. I'm here to help. That I can help you without ado. And I cannot thank Miriam and Anat enough. I feel good and hopeful. And I hope everybody else does. You're getting a lot of kudos in the chat. I have continued to put in the noshameonyou.org. Please feel free to visit that. And I'm sure Miriam and Nat, you can reach out to them there. So we'll see everybody. We're always here for Shabbat. And you're just getting one more fabulous after another. All right. Be well, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thanksgiving.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
happy
you.
Thanksgiving.
Happy Thanksgiving.
Vanessa.
Thank you.
Happy
Vanessa.
Thanksgiving.
Thanks.
Bye.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you. Most
Stay
informative.
safe, everybody.
Very nice.
Okay.